The human nervous system comprises a central part, the brain and spinal cord, and a peripheral part, the cranial and the spinal nerves and their branches. Extending from its junction with the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord connects the brain with the spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal, which arise from corresponding segments in the spinal cord. The segments which supply the limbs are enlarged. The cervical enlargement supplies the arms, and the lumbar enlargement the legs. The spinal nerves are connected to the spinal cord by ventral and dorsal roots. In the fetus, the vertebral column and the spinal cord are the same length, and the spinal nerves reach the foramina between the vertebrae by passing almost horizontally. The spinal cord does not grow as much as the vertebral column, and in the adult, it ends opposite the intervertebral disc between the first and second lumbar vertebrae. From the third cervical nerves downwards, the spinal nerves pass more and more obliquely and for greater distances to reach the corresponding foramen. The roots of the third sacral spinal nerve leave the cord opposite the 12th thoracic vertebra to reach the foramina between the third and fourth sacral vertebra, for example. The spinal cord ends by tapering to a conical portion called the conus medullaris, from which the filum terminale, consisting mostly of pia mater, extends to the coccyx. Those nerve roots which continue their course below the end of the cord form a sheath called the cauda equina. The spinal cord is partially separated into 2 halves by the anterior median fissure anteriorly and a more shallow groove, the posterior median sulcus, posteriorly. On each side of the posterior median sulcus is another groove, the posterolateral sulcus, along which the posterior spinal roots enter. The white matter between the two forms the posterior funiculi. In the cervical and upper thoracic segments, each funiculus is further divided into gracile and cuneate fasciculi. The region of white matter between the posterolateral sulcus and the anterior median fissure is the anterolateral funiculus. It is subdivided into the anterior and lateral funiculi by the ventral spinal roots. In contrast to the brain, the white matter of the spinal cord surrounds the grey matter. The white matter comprises association fibers linking different areas of the same side of the cord within a segment, commissural fibers linking corresponding parts of the 2 sides of the cord, and projection fibers which connect different segments. The grey matter is central, in a distinct H shape. The lateral masses are connected by the transverse grey commissure, through which runs the central canal. The greatest amounts of grey matter are in the cervical and lumbar enlargements, which supply the limbs. The grey matter is divided into the anterior, lateral, and posterior horns. The posterior horns receive information from sensory receptors. Different types are sensitive to crude touch and pressure, pain and temperature, vibration, joint position, and discriminative touch. Each posterior horn is capped by a mass of translucent tissue called the substantia gelatinosa. It extends throughout the length of the spinal cord. The substantia gelatinosa receives fibers from crude touch and pressure receptors and pain and temperature receptors. In front of the substantia gelatinosa is the nucleus proprius. It extends throughout the length of the spinal cord. The nucleus proprius receives fibers from vibration receptors, joint position receptors, and discriminative touch receptors. The thoracic nucleus, or Clark's nucleus, receives fibers from receptors sensitive to vibration and joint position. It extends from the 8th cervical to the 3rd or 4th lumbar segments. The lateral horns are important for involuntary functions. They are limited to 2 areas of the spinal cord. Lateral horn cells between the 2nd thoracic and the 1st and possibly 2nd lumbar segments of the cord give rise to fibers of the sympathetic system. Those in the second, third and fourth sacral segments to fibers of the parasympathetic system. The cells of the anterior horn supply the voluntary muscles. Cells supplying the trunk muscles are medial, and those supplying the limbs lateral. Cells for the extensor muscles are anterior, and those for the flexor muscles posterior. 2/3 are alpha motor neurons. They supply fibers which form the bulk of the muscle, the extrafusal fibers. The remainder are gamma motor neurons, which supply intrafusal muscle fibers, fibers which lie within tiny stretch receptors called muscle spindles. And so sensory information reaches the spinal cord through the posterior horns, and motor information leaves it through the anterior horns. Much sensory information ascends to the brain, and much of the total motor outflow descends from it. But some afferent impulses generate a motor response at spinal cord level. This simple pathway is called a reflex arc. The actions it brings about are reflexes, involuntary responses to stimuli at the level of the spinal cord. The arc of this type of reflex, the stretch reflex, is the most simple. It involves two neurons which synapse in the spinal cord. That is, it is monosynaptic. Stretching a muscle affects both its intrafusal and extrafusal fibers. Stretching of the equatorial zone of the intrafusal fibers generates impulses which reach the spinal cord. Here they synapse in the anterior horn with alpha motor neurons along whose axons impulses return to the extrafusal fibers, causing the muscle to contract. The response of muscle spindles, and therefore stretch reflexes, is influenced by higher centers. Information from the reticular formation, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum, for example, passes to gamma motor neurons in the anterior horn. Impulses reach the intrafusal fibers, causing their ends to contract and their equatorial zones to be stretched. This generates an afferent impulse in the spindle receptor and sets into motion the stretch reflex. The stretch reflex is important for normal muscle tone, the state of partial contraction of a muscle. Contraction is limited by spindle receptors in the muscle's tendons, which sense the increase in tension and generate impulses which inhibit the anterior horn cells.